She was shivering on a bench with nowhere to go until a struggling single dad gave her his only blanket, never guessing she owned half the city. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The wind bit harder than it had in weeks, slicing through the threadbare seams of Jason Brooks' old coat as he locked the garage doors for the night. The streets of Milford were quiet, dusted in frost, streetlights casting soft halos over the thin layer of snow. Jason's breath fogged in the air as he turned the key, listening to the familiar creak of hinges that probably needed fixing, but he hadn't had time or money. Behind him, bundled in 2 layers of mismatched wool, his daughter Lila stomped her boots for warmth and tried to catch snowflakes on her tongue. She was 7 and still had that magic in her eyes, the kind that didn't know bills or grief or what it meant to wonder if you'd have heat in the morning. Jason opened the trunk and reached for the faded blue blanket, the one with the frayed corners and stitched dinosaur pattern Lila used to drag around when she was 3. He had almost left it at home tonight, thought maybe she was too old for it now. But something told him to bring it, just in case. He shook it out, wrapping it tight around her as she climbed into the back seat of their rusty sedan. She yawned, snuggling into the fabric like it still held every bedtime story he'd ever told. Jason smiled softly and kissed her forehead before shutting the door. As he circled the car, he hesitated, a strange tug in his chest, like he was forgetting something. He looked back at the blanket through the window, warm, safe, familiar. And then he did something odd. He popped the trunk again, rummaged through old rags and half-used oil bottles, and found a second, thinner blanket buried beneath an emergency kit. He grabbed it, paused under the falling snow, and threw it into the passenger seat. No reason, no plan, just in case. He didn't know yet that tonight someone else would need it more than they did, or that a single act of quiet kindness, born from habit more than heroism, was about to crack his world wide open. The park was nearly empty, the kind of quiet that only winter could bring, where even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Jason's old sedan bumped gently over the curb as he turned into the lot, headlights slicing through the curtain of falling snow. It was just past 7, and the sky had darkened into a smoky blue. He had taken the long way home, hoping Lila would drift off in the back seat. She hadn't. Instead, she sat with her forehead pressed to the cold window, eyes scanning the world as if it might surprise her, and it did. "Daddy," she said suddenly, voice small, "that lady looks really cold." Jason's eyes followed her gaze. At the far end of the park, barely illuminated by a flickering lamp-post, sat a woman curled on a wooden bench. Her legs were pulled up, arms wrapped tightly around her knees. She wore what looked like office slacks, a long-sleeve blouse, and a coat far too thin for this kind of cold. No gloves, no hat. Her shoulders trembled visibly as another gust of wind tore through the trees. Jason's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. He thought about the bills waiting on his kitchen table, the empty gas tank, the long shift he had tomorrow. He thought about all the times he'd seen people walk past others like this, pretending not to notice. Maybe they were just afraid, maybe they were just tired. He understood both. He put the car in park. "Stay here," he told Lila gently. She nodded, watching as he opened the door and stepped into the cold. The snow crunched under his boots as he walked toward the woman. She didn't look up until he was a few feet away. "Miss," he said quietly, his breath forming clouds between them, "are you okay?" She blinked, startled. Her eyes, startlingly clear and deep-set, met his. "I'm fine," she lied, voice raw. Jason didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his coat, pulled out the blanket from the passenger seat, and held it out. "Just take it," he said. "Please." She stared at it, then at him. Something in her expression faltered, and then, without a word, she took the blanket with trembling hands and wrapped it around herself. Jason turned and walked back toward the car. As he slid into the driver's seat, Lila whispered, "You gave her our blanket." He nodded. "She needed it more." Neither of them knew that the woman on the bench was Elise Vance, and this night would become the hinge their lives would swing on forever. Snow still whispered from the sky as Jason eased the car back onto the road. In the rearview mirror, the bench grew smaller, the woman now just a shape huddled beneath the blue and green dinosaur print blanket. Lila had gone quiet in the back seat, hugging her knees, watching the flurry of lights pass through her window. Jason didn't say anything either. The heater clicked and wheezed, trying its best to chase away the cold. But the warmth didn't reach the weight in his chest. He kept thinking about the way she'd looked at him, not startled, not grateful in the way people sometimes fake when they're embarrassed, just tired, the kind of tired that sinks into your bones. When he'd offered the blanket, she hadn't argued. She hadn't put on a show of pride. She just took it, like someone who knew what it meant to go without and wasn't too proud to receive when it came gently. And right before he'd turned to go, her voice had stopped him. "Thank you," she'd kidded. Not soft, not dramatic, just full, like it came from some deep part of her that still believed kindness was rare. Her eyes had met his, sharp, intelligent, the kind of eyes that had seen too much but still noticed everything. Now, as the car trundled toward their apartment, Jason couldn't shake that voice. It followed him like a song half stuck in his head. He told himself he'd done the right thing, nothing more. Just a blanket, just a stranger. But there was something about the way she'd looked at him, like she hadn't been looked at in a while, not without judgment or expectation. At home, he helped Lila out of her boots, tucked her into bed with promises of pancakes in the morning. Still, his mind wandered back. He glanced once more at the folded paper in his jacket pocket, the note that had come with the blanket earlier, now replaced by the memory of her voice. He didn't even know her name, but somehow Jason felt like this wasn't the last time he'd hear it, whatever it was. Jason wasn't sure why he drove back. He told himself it was just part of his usual morning route, that he was dropping Lila at school and needed a quiet minute before heading into the garage. But as the town stirred awake, blinking through frost-laced windows and half-frozen coffee cups, his car curved down the side street that led to the park without much conscious decision. The bench came into view like a memory waiting for confirmation. Same place. Same dim lamp-post casting lazy shadows on the snow-dusted sidewalk. But the woman was gone. Jason slowed to a crawl, then parked beneath a bare-branched maple tree. He got out, boots crunching in the light snow. The morning air was still sharp, but not as bitter as the night before. His eyes found the bench almost immediately. The blanket was there, not sprawled out or half forgotten, folded, neat, almost reverent, as if the person who had used it wanted to leave a thank you without words. Jason approached slowly, unsure what he was even looking for. A trace of her? Some sign that it hadn't just been a passing moment? He reached down, fingers brushing the familiar fabric. That's when he saw it. A note, tucked inside the folds, barely peeking out. It was a small piece of paper, creased once down the center. Jason unfolded it, heart thudding harder than he liked to admit. In simple, elegant handwriting were just 10 digits. No name, no message, just a phone number. He stood there staring at it, the park stretching wide and empty around him. There was no sign of her, no footprints, no coffee cups, no trail to follow, just this quiet symbol left behind, like a breadcrumb in the snow. Jason slipped the note into his coat pocket, then sat on the bench for a moment, holding the folded blanket in his lap. The park was still, the world had moved on. But something about the morning felt suspended, like he was standing at the edge of something that hadn't yet shown its face. He didn't know what he'd do with the number. Not yet. But he didn't throw it away. He couldn't. The note lived in his coat pocket like it belonged there. Every time Jason reached for his keys, or dug out a wrench for a customer, or grabbed spare change for coffee, his fingers brushed the paper's worn edges. He never pulled it out in front of anyone, but it called to him all the same. Soft, steady, patient. 10 digits. That's all it was. But somehow it felt heavier than it should have. At night, After Lila was tucked beneath her mountain of blankets and stuffed animals, he'd sit at the kitchen table, the note laid flat beside a chipped mug of instant coffee. He'd stare at it in the dim yellow light, the same question echoing every time, what if? But he never called, because logic always won. What would he even say? Hey, remember me? I gave you a blanket. You were freezing on a bench, and now I'm bothering you at home because... What? I'm curious, lonely. Jason wasn't built for chasing mystery. He had responsibilities, rent, groceries, a daughter who needed her shoes replaced, and a winter coat that was starting to fray at the elbows. He didn't have time for daydreams, especially ones wrapped in elegant handwriting and late-night what-ifs. Still, the image of her wouldn't let go. Her eyes intelligent and tired, her voice steady even when her hands trembled, and the way she'd folded the blanket, so precise, so intentional, like she knew he'd come back for it, like she wanted him to. But why? Jason had never met anyone like her. She didn't look like she belonged in Milford. She didn't talk like someone who got stuck on benches in the cold. There was something layered beneath the surface, something more than chance. And yet, the phone stayed silent. He carried on fixing engines and rebuilding carburetors, wiping grease from his hands and helping Lila with spelling homework. But every so often, when the wind pressed against the windows just right, or the house got too quiet, Jason would reach into his pocket, unfold the paper, and just hold it. Not ready to let go, but still not ready to call. The alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m., but Jason was already awake. He hadn't really slept, not in the way that rest heals. His body was tired, sure, but his mind rarely shut off. It was always racing with numbers, deadlines, and lists he never seemed to finish. The heater groaned softly through the thin apartment walls, and Jason lay there for a moment, staring at the water-stained ceiling. Another day. Another chance to keep everything from slipping. He moved quietly through the morning. Toast in the toaster, lunch packed in a repurposed peanut butter jar. Lila's coat set out on the couch beside her scuffed sneakers. She shuffled out from her bedroom, still half asleep, hair tangled, face warm with sleep. He greeted her with a tired smile and a gentle pat on the head. They didn't have much, but he made it feel like they did. The small kitchen table doubled as a craft station. The couch sagged in the middle, but it was where they watched cartoons and read bedtime stories. The walls were bare, save for Lila's crayon art, taped like museum pieces with strips of masking tape. He'd once said they'd paint the place when things settled down. That had been 2 years ago. At the garage, Jason's hands were never still. Oil changes, engine rebuilds, patching up exhausts with more will than warranty. He was good at what he did, quiet, reliable, the kind of man customers trusted without needing him to explain every step. But good didn't always pay the bills. The rent was overdue again. The landlord had left another notice, folded sharp and impersonal. Jason had tucked it beneath the stack of unopened mail, one fire at a time. He never complained, not to Lila, not to co-workers, not even to himself. He just kept going, because quitting wasn't a luxury he had. He was mother and father, provider and storyteller, mechanic and dreamer, all wrapped into one sleep-deprived man with calloused hands and a stubborn heart. At night, after the tools were cleaned and Lila was asleep, he sometimes sat in silence, coffee cooling beside him, wondering how long he could keep juggling all the pieces. And every time, he came to the same quiet conclusion. As long as she needed him, he'd keep holding it all together, even if it broke him slowly. Jason had never let himself hope too much. Hope had teeth. It bit hard when things didn't pan out. But this time had felt different. 2 weeks ago, the regional manager from Northline Auto Group had stopped by the garage. Suited, polished, and clearly out of place among busted mufflers and rusted floor jacks, the man had asked to speak to Jason specifically. "I've heard about your work," he had said. "We're looking to expand our fleet service in this area. We'd need someone reliable, someone who doesn't cut corners." Jason had nodded, cautious but intrigued. The deal wasn't flashy, just consistent work. Corporate vehicles, maintenance contracts, predictable invoices, the kind of job that could give Lila new boots before winter ended, the kind that could make the rent notices stop. They'd shaken hands. The man had even said, "We'll finalize things next week." Jason had let himself believe it. Now, sitting in the back office with his phone clutched to his ear, and the words, "I'm sorry, Mr. Brooks, but corporate decided to move in a different direction," still echoing, Jason felt the sting. "A different direction," he repeated flatly, staring at the grease-stained calendar on the wall. "Yeah," the voice on the other end said, already moving on. "Nothing personal. Something came down from higher up. It's out of my hands." Jason hung up without saying goodbye. He sat there in the silence, the hum of the space heater sounding suddenly too loud. Outside, the garage floor buzzed with the usual noise, air compressors, clanking tools, the occasional shouted joke, but inside something sank in him. He'd let himself want more, and now it was gone. Again, what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly guess, was that Elise Vance had seen the proposal with his name attached. She had scanned the contract list that morning, eyes narrowing when she recognized the town, recognized him. She had scratched a single line through the request, not out of malice, but out of instinct. He deserved better than being used by her world before she could make things right. But to Jason, it was just another door that had shut before he could even get his hand on the handle. The morning was already a scramble. Lila had slept through her alarm, toothpaste ended up on her sweater, and Jason had dropped his only clean shirt in a puddle of oil at the shop last night. Now, with her lunchbox forgotten on the kitchen counter and time slipping through his fingers like sand, they were running late. Again. Jason turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed once, then nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. He sat back in the driver's seat, jaw tightening. "Come on, not today," he muttered under his breath, trying not to let the frustration bleed into his voice. He glanced at Lila, already strapped in and kicking her feet softly, watching him with wide eyes. "It's okay, kiddo," he said. "Just a hiccup." He popped the hood and stepped out, the bitter air stinging his skin as he lifted the heavy metal flap. Steam rose from somewhere it shouldn't have, and the familiar smell of burning coolant hit his nose. His gut sank. Whatever was wrong, it wasn't going to be fixed with a twist of the wrench and a prayer. Then he heard it. Tires crunching over gravel. A quiet engine. Jason turned just as a black SUV rolled to a slow stop behind them. The driver's window lowered, and there she was. Wrapped in a navy coat this time, her hair neatly pulled back, the same calm strength behind her eyes, but not as hollow as before. She leaned slightly toward the window, and for a heartbeat, both of them just stared. "You need a hand?" she asked, like they hadn't met on a park bench in the dark, like she hadn't been a mystery wrapped in his blanket. Jason straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Just a stubborn engine." She smiled faintly. "I've met a few of those." Before he could answer, the back window rolled down. Lila peered out, then lit up. "Hey, it's the lady from the bench." Elise's smile softened. "Nice to see you again, Lila." Jason didn't know what this was or why she was here, but as the snow swirled gently around them and her SUV idled behind their dead car, it didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt like a door had just quietly opened. Jason wasn't used to being offered help. He was used to being the help, the guy people called when their engines stuttered or their tires gave up halfway home. So when the woman from the bench leaned her arm out the SUV window and casually said, "I can give you two a ride?" his first instinct was to politely refuse. He opened his mouth to do just that, but Lila beat him to it. "Can we, Daddy? Please, I don't want to be late again." Jason glanced at his daughter, her hopeful eyes, the little pink gloves that were still too big, the lunchbox she now clutched like treasure. She hadn't said anything about missing the school's art show that morning, but he knew she'd been looking forward to it all week. He looked back at the woman in the SUV. She didn't look impatient or smug, just calm, waiting. He exhaled. "All right," he said carefully. "Thanks, we'll just be a few minutes." A warm blast of air hit them as they climbed in, and Lila immediately slid into the back seat like it was a magic chariot. Jason took the passenger seat, acutely aware of how his worn jacket looked against the pristine leather interior. As soon as they were buckled, Lila leaned forward between the seats. "You have seat warmers," she grinned. "This is so fancy." The woman chuckled. "You like it?" Lila nodded. "Yeah, our car's heater makes weird burping noises. Daddy says it's charming." Jason rubbed the back of his neck. "She exaggerates." The woman glanced at him with a half smile, then returned her eyes to the road. "I'm Elise, by the way." He nodded slowly. "Jason," and that's Lila. "Hi, Elise," Lila chirped. "Thanks for picking us up." "Any time," Elise replied, and it didn't sound like a courtesy. It sounded like a promise. As the SUV rolled smoothly toward the school, Jason couldn't shake the strange warmth rising in his chest. It wasn't just the heated seats. It was the feeling that somehow he and Lila were being seen. Not pitied, seen. And maybe, just maybe, this ride wasn't the end of something strange. Maybe it was the start. The SUV glided over snow-lined streets like it belonged to another world. Smooth, insulated, effortless. Inside it was quiet but not awkward. The heater purred. Lila hummed to herself in the back, tracing smiley faces into the fogged window. Jason sat stiffly in the passenger seat, hyper-aware of every scuff on his boots, every grease stain on his cuff. Elise drove with calm precision, one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally adjusting the heater. Her eyes flicked between the road and him with casual curiosity. Then, somewhere between Oak Ridge and the elementary school, she broke the silence. "What kind of work do you do, Jason?" He hesitated. "Mechanic. Been doing it most of my life. My dad had a shop. I sort of grew up in one." "Your own place?" she asked. "Not exactly. I work at a local garage. Decent folks, steady work. Not much more than that." She nodded, like she was taking mental notes, but didn't rush to respond. Instead, she asked, "If you could have your own place, would you?" Jason shot her a glance. "Why do you ask?" Elise shrugged lightly. "Just wondering. You strike me as someone who builds things. I guess I'm curious what you'd build for yourself." Jason looked back out the window. "I don't really think about that kind of stuff. Got enough to handle just keeping the lights on." She didn't press, just nodded again and said, "Fair enough." A few moments passed. Lila's voice floated up from the back seat. "My daddy fixes everything. He even made my nightlight work again with tape and a bobby pin." Jason smiled faintly, eyes still on the road ahead. "She gives me too much credit." "No," Elise said quietly. "I don't think she does." There was something in her tone, gentle, grounded, maybe even a little sad, that made Jason glance over again. "You always ask this many questions?" he said with a half smile. Elise laughed softly. "Only when I actually want to hear the answers." And for once, Jason didn't feel like he was being interviewed. He felt like he was being seen, and it scared him more than he cared to admit. The next time Jason saw her, it wasn't on the side of the road or behind the wheel of a luxury SUV. It was standing in the doorway of Harper's garage, a clipboard tucked under her arm, and a confused look on her face that felt just a little too practiced. Jason was bent over the hood of a beat-up sedan, elbow deep in a radiator that had decided to give up mid-commute. He looked up, startled. Elise smiled, calm, composed, like she hadn't planned the timing at all. "Car trouble?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag, trying to keep the surprise out of his voice. She nodded. "It's been making a clicking noise. Thought I'd get it looked at before it turns into something bigger." Jason raised an eyebrow. "The Phantom?" he said, referring to her sleek, practically space-age vehicle. She gave a small shrug. "Even the fancy ones break down, or so I've heard." Jason motioned for her to pull around, and she disappeared back out the door with the same grace she always seemed to carry, like the world never caught her off guard. But Jason couldn't help but feel the weight of her gaze linger in the air even after she left the room. When she returned, her SUV slid easily into the third bay. Jason got to work, tools in hand, while Elise sat in the waiting area. Though she barely looked at her phone, she watched instead. She watched how Jason explained a busted serpentine belt to an elderly woman using a comparison to a laundry line. Watched him drop down on one knee to tie a toddler's shoe while the child's father signed paperwork. Watched how the other mechanics, though gruff and overworked, asked for his opinion before making any big calls. She wasn't checking for his technical skill. She already knew he had that. She was watching the way he treated people, the way he handled trust. Jason noticed, of course. You don't grow up fixing things without learning to read people. But he didn't ask. He just kept working. By the time he'd identified the clicking as a harmless loose panel in her dashboard, one that hadn't made a single noise during his test drive, he turned to find her standing nearby, arms folded. "Well?" she asked, feigning innocence. "You're good to go," he said. She smiled. "I had a feeling you'd say that." And for a moment, it felt like she wasn't just evaluating a mechanic. She was searching for something else entirely. At first, Jason thought it was coincidence. Small town, after all, people crossed paths. That's just how it worked. But when Elise showed up at the diner 3 mornings in a row, never in a rush, always seated at the corner booth with black coffee and a book she barely touched, he started to notice. The first time, he gave her a polite nod from the counter. She returned it with a smile. The second time, she waved. The third time, she said, "You always get the same thing, black coffee and burnt toast. Is that a mechanic thing or just personal preference?" He'd chuckled and mumbled something about habit. But beneath the easy banter, something stirred in him, a question he didn't know how to ask. Then came the fundraiser. He was helping set up the folding tables at Lila's school, still in his work boots and flannel, when Elise walked into the gym like she belonged there. No assistant, no clipboard, just a tray of cupcakes in a paper box, and a shy smile for the teacher collecting donations. Lila spotted her first. "Elise," she squealed, racing over in her glittery sneakers. Elise crouched to her level. "You remembered my name." "I told my teacher you were the lady from the blanket story," Lila said proudly, "and that you were nice." Jason watched from across the room, half stunned, half amused. Elise caught his eye and raised a brow, as if to say, "What?" "I like cupcakes, too." He nodded slightly, but his thoughts were spinning. It wasn't just the diner or the fundraiser. She'd dropped by the garage again, twice, actually. Once for a weird noise that turned out to be a rock in the wheel well, and once because her air freshener wasn't working right. Jason wasn't blind. She was showing up. Not flashy, not dramatic, just present, and always watching. Not in a calculating way, but in a way that made him feel like she was learning the shape of his world. Mapping it, maybe, like she wasn't trying to escape something anymore, but instead trying to understand something that couldn't be bought or rebuilt. He didn't know what she wanted, but she kept showing up, and part of him, though he'd never say it out loud, didn't want her to stop. It was nearly dusk when Jason heard the front door slam, followed by the unmistakable thud of a backpack hitting the floor. Lila's boot squeaked across the kitchen tiles as she barreled in, cheeks flushed pink from the cold, eyes glowing with excitement. "Daddy!" she called, practically bouncing in place. "Look what I got!" Jason turned from the stove, spatula in hand, mid-flip on a grilled cheese. Before he could respond, Lila held up a winter coat, new, thick, beautifully stitched with soft fleece lining and a deep plum color that shimmered slightly in the low kitchen light. It was nicer than anything he'd ever bought her, nicer than anything he'd ever owned. Jason's stomach tightened. "Where'd that come from?" he asked carefully. Lila beamed. "It was in my cubby at school. No tag, just this." She pulled a small folded card from the coat pocket and handed it to him. In delicate handwriting, the note read, "Every princess needs armor. Stay warm, brave girl. There was no name, just a small hand-drawn crown at the bottom. Jason read it twice, then once more. She said it was probably from the coat fairy, Lila added with a grin, like the tooth fairy, but cooler. Jason forced a smile. Yeah, real generous of the coat fairy. But his mind was already racing. He wasn't stupid. He'd seen that handwriting before. Later that night, after Lila was asleep, warm in her new coat even beneath the blankets, Jason sat at the kitchen table, the note resting beside a lukewarm cup of coffee. He couldn't decide if he was grateful or something else. Elise had been kind. She'd helped, she showed up, but this felt different. It felt like stepping across a line. Not that he didn't appreciate it. Lila needed a coat. He knew that. But he also knew what it felt like to accept help that looked too much like pity. He sighed, folding the note once more. Maybe she meant well. Maybe she saw something in Lila that reminded her of herself. Or maybe, just maybe, this was her way of saying she wasn't done being part of their story. Either way, the coat was warm, and Lila hadn't stopped smiling all evening, and Jason wasn't sure whether that made it easier or harder. The diner was quieter than usual, the kind of lull that only came mid-afternoon when the breakfast crowd had vanished and the dinner rush hadn't yet begun. Jason sat across from Elise in their now familiar corner booth, steam rising from two mismatched mugs between them. Lila was at a friend's birthday party down the street, giving him exactly 1 hour of borrowed time he didn't plan to waste. But he hadn't expected Elise to say yes so easily when he asked if she wanted to grab coffee. She stirred her tea, her sleeves pushed up to the elbows, revealing a delicate watch Jason was certain hadn't come from anywhere local, the kind you don't find in pawn shops or on clearance racks. He filed that detail away, along with the others he'd been collecting in silence. They were halfway through some harmless conversation about weather and why the town's only stoplight blinked yellow for a full hour each night, when Elise said it. Offhand, like she didn't even realize. Well, the quarterly margin probably tanked after Q4's drop in overseas logistics. Global freight costs nearly doubled. She took a sip, then looked up casually. Sorry, that's force of habit. Jason paused mid-drink. He blinked. Most people didn't talk like that. Definitely not people who'd been shivering on park benches last week. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her over the rim of his mug. Her expression remained unreadable, like she hadn't just tossed out corporate jargon like it was weather chat. Quarterly margins, huh? He said finally, his voice light but edged with curiosity. Elise froze for a split second, not enough for most to notice, but Jason caught it. Her fingers tightened around the mug before she forced a chuckle. Old job, you pick up on the lingo. He nodded slowly. Must have been some job. Something like that, she murmured, eyes dropping to her tea. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, but it hung in the air like the moment after a dropped wrench, loud only because of what wasn't being said. Jason didn't press, but he did wonder, because that slip, small as it seemed, didn't come from someone lost or down on her luck. It came from someone who once ran the world she was now pretending to hide from. The apartment was dark, save for the soft hum of the old fridge and the faint glow from Jason's phone screen. Lila had fallen asleep hours ago, curled up under her dinosaur blanket, still clutching the hand-drawn crown Elise had left in her coat pocket. Jason had kissed her goodnight and whispered something about pancakes tomorrow, but his mind hadn't followed him to rest. Instead, it circled the same question again and again, like an engine misfiring, one that wouldn't quit until he popped the hood and looked inside. He sat on the edge of the couch, staring at his phone. Her voice kept replaying in his head. Quarterly margin probably tanked. Casual, automatic, revealing. Something wasn't adding up. And Jason, for all his quiet patience and grease-stained honesty, had always trusted one thing more than instinct, his gut. He opened a browser, typed in her name, just Elise at first, then Elise Automotive, Then, almost nervously, Elise Vance. He didn't expect much, maybe a few LinkedIn profiles or a wedding registry from a decade ago, but then he saw it. Forbes, 30 Women to Watch, Elise Vance, CEO of Vance Motors. Her photo was right there, crisp black blazer, that same calm expression, eyes that read everything, the same eyes that had looked up at him from a park bench in the cold. Jason's stomach dropped. He clicked the article. Read every line. She wasn't just wealthy. She was the Elise Vance, Fortune 500, Executive of the Year, built her company from legacy to powerhouse, rumors of taking over one of the top 3 automakers in the country. He stared at the screen, disbelief tightening in his chest. Why the hell was someone like her wrapped in a blanket on a bench outside his shop? Jason leaned back, the phone still glowing in his hand, as if it had just handed him a secret too big to carry. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But one thing was certain now. The woman who kept showing up at his diner, who brought coats and asked about dreams, wasn't just anyone. She was Elise Vance, and she'd been hiding in plain sight. Jason didn't mean to bring it up that day, not like that. He'd rehearsed a dozen different versions in his head, each one measured, calm, maybe even a little clever, but none of them made it out, because when Elise showed up again, walking into the garage like she had every right to be there, like she belonged, he snapped. She was leaning against the wall near the tool bench, waiting for him to finish up with an old pickup's spark plugs. She looked effortless, like she always did, dressed down in jeans and a soft wool coat. But Jason's heart was beating in a way it hadn't in years, and this time it wasn't because of her smile. He set the wrench down a little too hard, wiped his hands on a towel that didn't really help, and walked over. "You going to keep pretending?" he asked, his voice low. Elise blinked. "Pretending?" He pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped the screen once. The Forbes photo stared back at them both. "Why lie?" he asked. She didn't look away, didn't flinch. "I wasn't lying," she said, quiet but sure. "I was hiding." Jason swallowed the rush of words pressing at his throat. "You're Elise Vance, CEO. You're worth, what, $100 million? And you were out there freezing on a bench like you had nowhere to go?" "I didn't," she replied. That stopped him. "I had rooms," she added. "Hotels, homes, property portfolios, if you want to count them. But none of it felt safe. None of it felt real." Jason stared at her, unsure what to believe. The woman in the photo was powerful, poised, unreachable. The woman in front of him had rawness in her voice, honesty in her eyes. "I wasn't looking for attention," Elise said. "I wasn't trying to trick you. I was trying to disappear. And that night, you saw me anyway." He crossed his arms, jaw tight. "Why keep coming back?" She shrugged gently. "Because I didn't expect to miss being seen." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The hum of the garage filled the silence. But something else moved between them. Something fragile and growing. Not anger, not suspicion. Recognition. They sat on the hood of her SUV, parked just behind the garage, where the gravel met the tall grass and the streetlights didn't quite reach. It was late, well past closing, but neither of them had moved to leave. The air smelled like cooling metal and pine, the sky above stretching wide and dark with only a few stars peeking through. Elise held a steaming paper cup between her hands, the same coffee Jason had offered from the dented old machine in the break room. She hadn't touched it yet. Jason waited. He wasn't pushing, but the silence between them was heavy, like the story was already sitting there, waiting to be spoken. "I didn't run away from home," she began, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I ran away from myself." Jason didn't speak. He just turned his head slightly, listening. "I built everything fast, too fast," she said. "My dad left me the company when I was 26. Everyone expected me to fail. I didn't. But I also didn't stop, not once. For 10 years, I was always first in, last out. Hours, partnerships, boardroom wars. Every headline made me feel less human." She paused, taking a breath so slow it almost caught. Then came the lawsuit. My CFO, someone I trusted, embezzled millions, and I didn't catch it in time. The board blamed me. Investors pulled out. Suddenly, all the hands that once clapped were pointing. Jason shifted, but still said nothing. They said I needed to go on leave, Elise continued. PR suggested something public, a wellness retreat, a sabbatical, something to save face. I packed a bag, got in my car, and just kept driving. She finally looked at him. I didn't plan on ending up on a park bench. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just wanted to be nowhere, be no one. Jason looked down at his hands, grease-stained, calloused, grounded in a life she'd never known. But you still showed up, he said softly. She nodded. And you didn't ask who I was. You didn't try to fix anything but what was in front of you. Jason exhaled slowly, the weight of her story sinking in. His world didn't have room for Fortune 500 betrayals and investor backstabbing. But pain? Pressure? The feeling that the people around you only stayed as long as you were useful? That, he understood. And maybe, just maybe, so did she. The envelope was tucked beneath the garage's front doormat, cream-colored, thick, sealed with a gold-embossed V. Jason found it after locking up for the night, the kind of letter that didn't belong in a place where brake fluid stained the floor and wrenches clanked like a soundtrack. He almost didn't open it. Thought maybe it was a vendor pitch or another marketing gimmick from a parts distributor, but the moment he slid his finger under the flap and saw the handwriting, he knew. Inside was a single card. Saturday evening, 7 p.m., Harborview Grand Hotel, formal attire. I'd be honored if you and Lila would join me. Elise. He read it twice, then once more. Formal, Harborview. That wasn't just an invitation, that was a world he didn't live in. That night, over macaroni and microwaved peas, he read the note aloud to Lila. Her eyes went wide. A hotel party? Like with sparkly chandeliers and tiny desserts? Jason laughed. Something like that. But I don't have a dress, she said, frowning. Not a fancy one. Jason opened his mouth, ready to say they probably couldn't go, that they didn't fit that kind of place. But then there was a knock at the door. A delivery driver stood on their front step with a flat garment bag in one hand and a box tied with gold ribbon in the other. Delivery for Jason Brooks, the man said. Inside the bag, a tailored charcoal gray suit, crisp white shirt, deep blue tie. In the box, a soft tulle dress the color of morning frost, delicate and twinkling like it had been designed for Lila and no one else. No receipt, no invoice, just a note tucked beneath the tissue paper. No one should miss a night just because they weren't born into it. Can't wait to see you both. E. Jason stared at the note for a long time. His pride wrestled with the gesture, but when Lila twirled in front of the mirror, eyes shining, asking, "Do I look like someone who belongs?" He didn't have the heart to say anything but yes, because deep down, part of him wondered the same thing. And Elise, she seemed determined to answer it for them both. The lobby of the Harborview Grand looked like something out of a movie Jason might have caught the end of on TV. Glass chandeliers glittering like frozen fireworks, marble floors that echoed with every step, and people dressed in fabrics he didn't even know how to name. Lila clutched his hand, her tulle dress brushing against his legs, her eyes as wide as saucers. Jason adjusted the cuffs of the suit Elise had sent, his fingers awkward around fabric so smooth it made him nervous to touch anything. He wasn't used to polished shoes or jackets that actually fit across the shoulders. Every part of him felt too loud, too obvious. But then Elise appeared. She stepped through the crowd like she'd been born in it. Black gown, hair swept back, eyes scanning until they landed on him. And when they did, she smiled in that way that made the whole room dim just a little around her. She crossed the floor without hesitation and reached for Lila's hands first. "You look like royalty," she said gently. Lila giggled. "Daddy said I looked like a snowflake." "You do," Elise said. then turned to Jason. "And you clean up better than you think." Jason scratched the back of his neck, cheeks warming. "This place isn't exactly my usual crowd." "Good," Elise said, looping her arm through his. "They could use more of you." As they entered the ballroom, heads turned. The lighting was soft, the music live, strings playing something elegant Jason couldn't name. Waiters floated by with glasses of champagne and trays of appetizers Jason wouldn't dare pronounce. Whispers followed them, recognition, curiosity, confusion. Elise Vance rarely showed up to her own events, and when she did, she never brought guests. But she never left Jason's side. She introduced him not as a mechanic, but as someone you'll be hearing more about. She spoke about Lila like she was family. And when a woman in a sequined dress leaned over and asked Jason too sweetly, "How did you two meet?" Elise didn't flinch. "He gave me a blanket when I didn't even know I needed one," she said. And in that room where nothing was familiar, Jason felt something strange settle in his chest. Maybe he didn't belong here by the world's standards, but with Elise beside him, he didn't feel like he had to. The ballroom pulsed with the kind of polite energy that came with too much money and not enough truth. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting delicate shadows across linen-covered tables and the polished sheen of designer shoes. Jason kept close to Elise, his hand occasionally brushing against the fabric of her gown, the only thing grounding him as whispers started to grow around them. He noticed it first by the sideways glances, half-second flickers of recognition from men in tailored suits and women draped in silk. A few leaned toward one another, murmuring beneath the clink of glasses and the swell of violins. One man's brow furrowed. A woman tilted her head and narrowed her eyes like she was trying to place a face from a distant memory. Then came the first voice Jason could actually hear. "Isn't that the guy from the mechanic shop on Birch, the one with the kid?" Jason stiffened. He tried to pretend he didn't hear it, but Elise caught the change in him immediately. Another voice followed, this one sharper, edged with something colder. Didn't think Elise was the type to slum it for company. Jason took a small step back. The room felt too glossy, too tight. He didn't belong here. He knew that before he walked in, but now the walls seemed to be closing in with every smirk and whispered word. But Elise didn't move away. She didn't shy from the stares or pretend she hadn't heard. Instead, she turned toward the cluster of curious onlookers, lifted her chin, and said clearly enough for a dozen people to hear, "This is Jason Brooks." A pause. Attention sharpened. "He's the man who saved my life." Silence spread like a ripple across a still pond. She wasn't smiling, not in the charming, social way. This was different, fierce, steady, real, the kind of look that dared anyone to speak again. Jason looked at her, something caught between disbelief and gratitude stirring in his chest. Elise reached for his hand, squeezed it once. And in that room full of whispers and wealth, he realized something else entirely. She wasn't just protecting him, she was claiming him. It happened after the crowd had thinned, and the chandelier's glow had dimmed into something warmer, quieter. The ballroom's noise had melted into background murmurs, and Jason found himself on the balcony outside, leaning on the railing, watching the city lights flicker like restless stars. The night air was cool but not biting, just enough to clear his head. He needed it. After the whispers, after that moment. After Elise's hand had found his like it belonged there. He didn't hear her footsteps, but he knew it was her. "You okay?" she asked softly, stepping up beside him. Jason nodded, not trusting his voice just yet. "I've never been in a room like that." Elise smiled gently. "You handled it better than most CEOs I've met." Jason chuckled dryly. "I doubt that." She leaned on the railing next to him, her gown catching the light like liquid coal. "You ever think about what you'd do if you had your own place?" He glanced at her. "The garage?" "Yeah," she said, eyes still on the city. Your name on the sign, your rules. No one telling you which cars are worth your time and which customers to ignore. Jason exhaled. I've thought about it 100 times, just never thought it was possible. Elise turned toward him now fully. There was something in her expression, calm, focused, serious, in a way he hadn't seen before. What if I said I could make it possible, she asked. A real partnership, your garage, fully equipped, new tools, a few extra staff to lighten the load. You run it, I just help get it off the ground. Jason stared at her. I'm not offering charity, she added quickly, her tone firm but gentle. I'm offering a chance to build something that's yours, something sustainable, something Lila could grow up around and be proud of. He didn't answer right away. He couldn't. The words landed like thunder in his chest, loud and unbelievable. Elise stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. You gave me a blanket when I had nothing but my name. Let me give you a foundation to build the life you deserve. Jason blinked, heart pounding, hands gripping the railing. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to say. Because Hope, real Hope, had just shown up in a black dress and asked if he was ready. The night air settled heavier than before, pressing gently on Jason's chest like a quiet warning. The lights of the ballroom glowed behind him, golden and warm, but out here on the balcony, the shadows felt closer. Elise's offer hung between them like a thread waiting to be pulled. Bright, unreal, impossible. He looked at her, really looked. And for the first time, he saw the full picture. Not just the woman from the bench or the guest who kept showing up. He saw the CEO, the empire builder, the woman whose name could open doors in rooms he didn't even know existed. And suddenly, all he could feel was the space between them. I can't take it, he said quietly. Elise tilted her head, her brows pulling slightly. Why not? Jason exhaled, eyes fixed on the skyline. Because I don't want to be someone's project. I don't want to wake up every morning wondering if the only reason I've got a business is because someone felt sorry for me. Elise didn't move, didn't interrupt. He ran a hand through his hair, tension rising. You've seen what my life looks like. You've stepped into it. It's messy and loud and small, but it's mine. I've built every bit of it with scraped knuckles and late bills and Lila asleep in the back seat while I finish one last repair. He finally looked at her. I don't want her to think success means someone had to swoop in and save us. Elise didn't flinch, didn't look away. She just took a step forward and said softly, You're not a charity case, Jason. You never were. He opened his mouth, but she kept going. You didn't ask for anything. You've never taken more than you gave. That night on the bench, you didn't even know who I was. You gave me warmth anyway, no agenda, no hesitation. That wasn't pity, that was integrity. And this, she gestured between them, this isn't charity, it's faith, it's partnership. Jason stood still, heart caught between pride and disbelief. And though he didn't say it out loud, part of him wished he could believe her. He just wasn't sure how, not yet. The envelope was thin, white, taped to the garage door with a single strip of Scotch tape that fluttered in the wind like a warning. Jason saw it before he even unlocked the shop that morning, and the moment his eyes landed on the bold red notice, his stomach dropped. Inside, the letter was brief, just a few lines of legalese wrapped around the same punch. Pay the back rent in full within 7 days or vacate the property. He stood there for a long time, the paper crumpling slightly in his hand as the cold bit at his neck. The shop behind him still smelled like yesterday's oil change and burnt rubber. The tools were neatly organized. The calendar on the wall still read, This is the month everything turns around. He had written that in ink the day he thought the Northline contract would go through. Jason tossed the letter onto the front desk and got to work. What else was he supposed to do? That week moved in slow motion. Customers came in, some loyal, some new. He smiled, he worked, he wiped grease from his hands and made small talk. But inside he was fraying. There were too many bills, too few jobs, and now this looming deadline wrapped around his throat like a rope. He didn't tell Lila. He couldn't. She'd been drawing blueprints of a pretend future garage in her sketchbook, complete with a snack bar and a corner labeled Princess Mechanic Station. Jason couldn't bear the thought of ripping that dream away just yet. And Elise? She didn't come by. She didn't text, didn't call, didn't show up at the diner or the garage or anywhere in between. At first it stung, but then he realized she was giving him space. She had made her offer, and now she was stepping back to let him choose. No pressure, no rescue, just silence. And Jason, surrounded by sockets and spark plugs and the weight of a world he was holding up with two tired hands, found himself wishing, maybe for the first time, that she would come walking through the door again, but she didn't. Not yet. It was late, long after dinner, and Jason was cleaning out Lila's backpack like he always did on Sundays, sorting through crumpled math worksheets, snack wrappers, and the occasional sticky surprise. She was asleep in her room, breathing soft and slow beneath her blanket, the same one he'd once handed to a stranger on a bench. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the fridge and the ticking of the wall clock that ran 2 minutes fast. Near the bottom of the bag, tucked between a drawing of a purple octopus and a spelling test with a gold star, he found the envelope. No address, no postage, just his daughter's name, Lila, written in a looping, elegant script he knew too well. He sat down at the kitchen table and opened it carefully, his hands suddenly unsure. Inside was a single folded card. No glitter, no cartoon characters, just a simple cream note card with words written in dark ink. Dear Lila, thank you for sharing your dad with me. He reminded me who I want to be. Love, Elise. Jason read it once, then again. The words were simple, unassuming, but they knocked something loose in him. This wasn't a message for him. Not directly. It was a quiet confession. A truth wrapped in gratitude and tucked inside a little girl's backpack like it didn't carry the weight of everything. He sat back in the chair, staring at the card. She had stayed away, yes, let him stand on his own. But she hadn't really disappeared. She was still reaching out, just not to pressure him, not to fix it, but to say something far more personal. He reminded me who I want to be. Jason didn't know what tomorrow would bring. The eviction notice still loomed. The bank account still sat near empty. But in that moment, with that note in his hand and his daughter sleeping safely down the hall, something shifted. He wasn't alone in this story, and Elise hadn't just seen him. She'd been changed by him. Jason stared at the phone for a long time before touching it. It sat on the edge of the workbench, dusty and cracked at the corner, surrounded by old spark plugs and a half-empty cup of cold coffee. The garage was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of stillness that settles when you know there's no more wiggle room when the clock runs out and there's nowhere left to push. The eviction deadline was tomorrow. He'd sold 2 toolboxes already, canceled the grocery run, skipped dinner, told Lila he wasn't hungry, and pretended it was because of the chili from lunch. But really, he just couldn't stomach anything. Not until he figured out what to do. The folded note from Elise still sat in his jacket pocket. Thank you for sharing your dad. He'd read it so many times it had become part of him. He picked up the phone, not to beg, not to ask for a check, just to talk. Her voice came through on the second ring. Calm, warm, familiar in a way that softened everything inside him. Jason? He hesitated. Hey. A pause. I was hoping you'd call. I'm not calling for money, he said quickly, almost too quickly. I know, she said before he could finish. Go on? He took a breath. If you were me, if you had a place falling apart and a kid depending on you and pride getting in the way of everything, what would you do? Elise was quiet for a beat. Then her voice dropped, steady and true. I'd stop thinking I had to do it all alone. I'd remember that asking for help isn't failure, it's wisdom. And I'd stop waiting for everything to fall apart before letting someone stand beside me. Jason looked around the garage, his garage. The same one his father taught him to fix brakes in. The same one where Lila sat drawing pictures while he changed tires. And for the first time, he saw it differently, not as a burden, as a beginning. He closed his eyes. "Okay," he said, let's talk. And that's when everything began to change. Not because he gave up, but because he finally let someone in. The new sign went up on a Thursday. A fresh coat of blue paint gleamed in the morning sun, the letters bold and proud above the double bay doors. Brooks and Vance Auto, fueled by grit, backed by grace. Jason stood on the sidewalk across the street and hands in his pockets, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It didn't feel real, not yet. Inside, the garage had been transformed. The creaky lift was replaced with a new hydraulic model. The tool walls gleamed with freshly polished wrenches and diagnostics equipment he used to only see in catalogs. A proper waiting area had been added, coffee machine, kids' corner, even magazines that hadn't been printed 10 years ago, but somehow it still felt like his place. Nothing glossy, nothing fake. Just better. He didn't hear Elise walk up behind him, but he knew it was her before she spoke. "Looks good, doesn't it?" she said, sliding her sunglasses onto her head. Jason glanced at her, then back at the sign. "Still getting used to seeing both names up there." She smiled. "Mine's only there because yours was never going to be alone." By 10 o'clock, the grand opening crowd had already gathered. Locals who had brought their cars to Jason for years, some out of necessity, some out of loyalty, showed up in droves. Some brought coffee. Others brought flyers to pin on bulletin boards across town. Lila wore a tiny mechanic's jumpsuit with a patch that read, "Assistant Boss." She handed out cupcakes and business cards with equal joy. A few newspaper reporters circled the lot, jotting notes and asking questions. When one of them asked Jason how the partnership happened, he just shrugged and said, "Started with a blanket, grew from there." The cash register rang for the first official transaction at noon. A tire rotation, simple job. But the woman paid in full and handed Jason a tip with tears in her eyes. "You fixed my car 3 years ago and didn't charge me," she said. "Glad I can finally give something back." By evening, the garage was still buzzing, and Jason, once unsure if he even belonged in a room with Elise, stood in a space that was entirely his, built with grit, backed by grace, and full of people who'd been waiting for this moment as long as he had. The emails started trickling in a week after the grand opening. At first, Jason thought they were spam, subject lines like strategic opportunity and corporate partnership proposal. He ignored the first few. But then came a phone call from a number with a New York area code, followed by a voicemail from a man named Grant Collings, Director of Operations at Titan Auto Systems. Jason listened with a frown as the voice on the other end spoke in polished tones about admiration, innovation, and the kind of leadership we've been looking for. Apparently, word had spread. A single dad from a quiet town builds a garage with a Fortune 500 CEO? It made waves in places Jason had never imagined. By the end of the week, he'd heard from 3 more companies. One offered to fly him out first class for a meeting in Chicago. Another dangled a 6-figure consulting retainer. A third mentioned a keynote speaking gig at an industry summit. Jason read the proposals late at night, sitting at the same kitchen table where he'd once sorted overdue bills and crayon drawings. The numbers were tempting, the prestige surreal. But none of it stirred him. He walked into the garage the next morning just after sunrise. The new sign caught the morning light again. Lila had taped one of her handmade posters to the front desk. Free tune-ups for superheroes. Ask my dad. The smell of coffee drifted in from the waiting room. One of the new hires, Javier, was already sweeping the floor, humming off key. The heater clunked to life. The day was starting. Jason pulled out his phone and drafted a single message. He sent it to every company that had reached out. "Thank you for the offer. I'm honored, but I already have what I want. No fluff, no regret." He put the phone away, rolled up his sleeves, and walked back into the garage. A woman with a rattling engine and 2 toddlers in the back seat had just pulled up. And Jason smiled, because while the world was finally noticing him, he'd already found the only spotlight that mattered, under the hood, with grease on his hands, building something real. The folding chairs in the elementary school gym creaked as parents shuffled to find seats, murmuring softly as kids in construction paper hats and glitter-smeared costumes lined up near the front. Jason sat near the back, arms crossed loosely, watching Lila bounce on her toes with nervous energy. She'd been talking about this All About Me presentation for weeks, had rehearsed it in the mirror, whispered it in the car, even tried it out on the dog next door. Elise had insisted on coming. She sat beside Jason now, legs crossed, hands clasped tightly in her lap, wearing a soft blue sweater that somehow made her feel both out of place and exactly where she belonged. She didn't say much, but Jason noticed her knee bouncing ever so slightly. She was nervous, too. When Lila's name was called, she stepped onto the little riser with a confidence that made Jason's heart stretch. Her paper was crumpled at the corners, her shoelace untied, but she stood tall. "My name is Lila Brooks," she said proudly, "and this is my story." She talked about her favorite color, purple, her dream job, fixing rocket ships, and the best food in the world, pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. The crowd laughed. Then her voice softened. "My hero is my dad. He fixes everything, even when we don't have the right tools. He makes me feel safe, even when we're scared. And he taught me that being kind is more important than being fancy." Jason blinked quickly, his throat tightening. "And," she added, glancing toward the back of the room, "I have a bonus mom now. Her name is Elise." Jason turned toward Elise just as her breath hitched. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at the front like she was trying to memorize the moment. "She didn't come from my family," Lila continued, "but she found us anyway. And now we keep her." There was a soft murmur from the audience, a few quiet laughs, a tear or two. Jason didn't take his eyes off Elise. And in that moment he realized something deeper than love had formed between them, something chosen. And it was Lila who named it first. It was just past dusk when Jason closed up the garage, the tools locked, the lights dimmed, the quiet settling in like an old friend. The sky was streaked with shades of lavender and gold, the kind of color that made even the tiredest days feel softer. Lila was at a sleepover, her giggles still echoing in Jason's ears from the ride home. The apartment was unusually still when he stepped inside. No cartoons, no scuffed sneakers in the hallway, just the low hum of the fridge and the warmth of a home that had finally started to feel like one. And there, on the couch, was the blanket. The same one he'd handed to a shivering stranger on a freezing night, folded neatly, lovingly, like it had waited just long enough to find its way back. Jason froze, his breath catching in his throat. Resting atop it was a small note, folded once, no envelope, no flourish, just a quiet message, waiting. He sat down slowly, the old couch sighing beneath him, and unfolded the paper. "Can I stay this time?" No signature, no need. He read it once, then again, the words wrapping around his heart like the blanket itself. Simple, soft, steady. Elise stepped out from the hallway a moment later, still in her work clothes, but barefoot now, her eyes searching his. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Jason looked up at her, holding the note in one hand, the blanket in the other. "You sure?" he asked, voice low. She nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything." No ring, no kneeling, no grand gestures, just a question, and a man who knew the weight of second chances. Jason scooted over and patted the space beside him. "Then don't leave again." She smiled, stepped forward, and sat down, her hand finding his like it had 100 times before. No ceremony, just home. The blanket sat between them like a bridge, old, familiar, full of memories stitched into every frayed edge. Jason held the note in his lap, his thumb brushing over the words again, as if they might vanish if he stopped touching them. "Can I stay this time?" It wasn't a grand confession or a sweeping promise. It was a whisper, a hope. A door cracked open. Elise sat beside him silent, her eyes on his profile. She didn't press, didn't ask again. She just waited, the same way she always had, with quiet patience that didn't demand answers, only presence. Jason's chest rose slowly with the kind of breath that took weeks to reach. He thought of everything that had brought them here, the cold park bench, the broken-down car, the nights of almost and maybes and silent prayers, the garage, the fundraiser, the letter in Lila's backpack, the day Lila called her family. He didn't say yes. He didn't need to. Instead, he reached across the blanket and slid his fingers into hers, gently, deliberately, like he was choosing something fragile and sacred and fully his. Her eyes softened. She turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers like it had always been waiting to happen. Jason didn't let go, not after a second, not after a minute. He just held on, because this hand in his, was the answer. Not with words, but with everything he had left. And as the last light outside faded and the room around them filled with a silence that felt like peace, Jason knew. This wasn't the end of something beautiful. It was the beginning of something real. The garage still smelled like oil and metal and whatever strange combination of coffee and burnt toast Jason brewed every morning. The tools still clanked. The lift still groaned when the older trucks rolled in. Grease still found its way under fingernails and into the seams of every pair of jeans Jason owned. That part hadn't changed. It was still a working man's place. A little loud, a little messy, and full of the kind of grit that couldn't be bought. But somehow it had become something else too. There were flower drawings taped to the waiting room window now, all signed in big loopy letters, Lila. One morning she'd picked a handful of wildflowers from the lot behind the building and arranged them in a plastic cup, then proudly set them on the front desk. Elise replaced the cup with an actual vase the next day, but the flowers stayed. Always fresh, always bright. Laughter echoed through the bays now, Javier cracking jokes with customers, Elise teasing Jason when he got too serious about carburetors. Lila darted between oil changes and brake checks like she owned the place, her clipboard covered in stickers, occasionally reminding Jason of appointments he hadn't even remembered scheduling. Every Friday someone brought food. Sometimes it was Elise, with something warm and elegant. Sometimes it was Jason's chili, which always tasted better on day 2. Occasionally it was Lila with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches cut into stars. Customers stayed longer than they used to, not because of delays, but because they wanted to. Conversations spilled past the counter. People asked about Lila's school projects, brought in hand-me-downs or cupcakes, dropped off drawings for the bulletin board. The community didn't just support the shop, they became part of it. One afternoon, Jason stood at the doorway with his arms crossed, watching Elise laugh with a customer over something Lila had said. The garage buzzed behind them, tires turning, phones ringing. But all he saw was the life they'd built, not shiny, not perfect, but full. He used to think home was something you paid rent for, a roof, a key. Now he knew better. Home was here, noisy, greasy, bright with wildflowers, and more real than anything he'd ever known. The paper was titled in big, careful letters, each word pressed into the page with a kind of pride that only comes from truth. My dad gave away his last blanket and got a whole new life in return. It sat at the top of the stack on her teacher's desk, neatly stapled, corners smoothed flat. Lila Brooks, now 12, had written it for her school's annual storytelling contest. The prompt was simple: tell the story that shaped your life. And Lila didn't hesitate. She began with a cold night, one bench, one stranger, one blanket that had meant more to her and her dad than anyone could ever guess. She described the way her father had tucked her into the back seat of their old car, kissed her forehead, and then walked toward the woman sitting alone in the freezing dark. "He gave her our last blanket," she wrote. "He didn't ask her name. He just saw someone hurting and tried to make it hurt less." Lila wrote about the days that followed, the broken-down car, the fancy lady with kind eyes who kept showing up, the coat that arrived without tags, the invitation that changed everything. But what came next wasn't just about surprises or second chances. Lila didn't write about money or business deals. She didn't talk about suits or hotel ballrooms. She talked about watching her dad smile for the first time in a long while, about Elise teaching her how to braid her hair before school, about the garage that smelled like cookies and oil, where people came for more than just repairs. And at the very end, Lila wrote this: "I used to think fairy tales were about castles and crowns. But I think real ones start with a blanket, a broken-down car, and someone who decides not to walk away." The essay won the contest, but more than that, it made people cry. Not because it was sad, but because it was true. Jason read it late one night, long after Lila had gone to bed, his calloused hands gently smoothing each page. He didn't say anything, just sat there, holding the words like they were holy. And somewhere deep inside, he finally let himself believe it. He had given something small, and the world had given him everything in return.